Three, two, one. How you doing?
Hello, welcome to the podcast. Pardon us, Rick is unable to make it. For this one, we'll be discussing the organizational and the operational aspects.
Yeah, it's something we talk about a lot, the difference between operational versus organizational. And, of course, within the mafia, they don't really need to make that distinction. Those aren't terms you'll necessarily hear the members say. It's something that we use as outsiders to better understand some of the dynamics, some of the differences between what's formal versus informal, what's official versus what's de facto.
Absolutely. When it comes to organizational, that really relates to formal positions within a family. Boss, underboss, consigliere, capo de china, ordinary member. Those are formal organizational positions. What people do in terms of acting as a messenger or even being known as a hitman, that's operational. Never in the history of the subject has there ever been like what the cartels have regarding sicarios and stuff like that. They have their own hit crews. Drug operations, they have their own enforcement crews. The way that a drug crew is set up, it is very much revolves around the business that is an operation. You have your runners, you have your dealers, crew bosses, your enforcers, in some cases your accountants, all the way on up. This in no way is similar to what constitutes the mafia. They don't have those type of ranks. What they decide to do, that is operational. But when it comes to having a formal meeting, that's organizational. We could all be members here. You're a millionaire, I'm a brokester, Tony's something else. We get called to a meeting and we're all soldiers. We're going there as official members, all part of the same thing.
Right. And I think sometimes people read too much into what each of the organizational terms mean, where I think the biggest one of all is the term soldier. And we do know that's in use in Sicily, soldado. People hear soldier, though, and they think grunt. They think almost of an associate, and they have a tendency to downplay what an amico nostra is, which could be someone of extremely high importance. It doesn't necessarily mean somebody who's on the street doing all of the gritty, low-level work. It could be that. But being a member is an honor. It comes with it a certain status that isn't always reflected in the terminology that's used. And there's a range of what that person could be. Not all soldiers are equal. They might be in terms of organizational rank, but not necessarily in terms of de facto influence, what they're involved with business-wise or crime-wise, how much they're respected. So sometimes you'll point out that somebody only ever held the rank of soldier, and another researcher will be like, well, he couldn't have been a soldier because he was this, because he had access to the boss, because he made this much money, he had all these relationships. And I understand where they're coming from on that, of course, that the term soldier does kind of make that guy seem like he's less than something else or less than someone else. But in that mafia itself, they don't see it that way. Within the organization itself, they don't see being a soldier as a peon, a lower rung. They're all amici nostri, and they're all members of the brotherhood. Doesn't mean they always respect each other, but with it comes a certain status, and not just a certain status, but a range of opportunities. And you hear the guys say this when they're inducted, that when they become a member, the sky is really the limit. As long as they put things on record, as long as the leadership approves of what they're doing, there's really no stopping them. There's really no ceiling on what they can do.
It's like what Nick Caramandi said when he joined in Philadelphia. In his book, he goes into how one doesn't join, one is selected. And in the whole wide world, there's only 60 members, and he is now a part of that. He doesn't say that he's just a soldier. I mean, going from associate to soldier is a very significant thing. And everybody that talks about their ceremonies, they talk about it as a very significant event in their life. The majority of the membership, they are ordinary members or soldiers, whatever term we use. But when it comes to the ranks, and we're going to go into this more later on, but capo de china and up to the administration, they're better viewed as office positions than they are as on the same hierarchy as middle management in a drug or cartel operation. They're not there to tell its members what to do or what to commit. Orders come down, but people or the members on, left to their own, they're going to go in and do what they want to do. Granted, they adhere to some very limited, loose regulations within the society in terms of what they can or cannot do. Series like Boardwalk Empire or other shows that depict the early history, and what you see is a fictional portrayal of bosses micromanaging their soldiers. Like,
Giving
you go
orders.
do this, you go do this. Hey, boss, can I go do this? You go ahead. It wasn't really like that.
And a good case study is someone like John Roselli of the Los Angeles family. He later transferred to Chicago, where he was, as far as we know, he was only ever a quote unquote soldier in Los Angeles. By all accounts, he was almost as powerful as the boss. And depending on who the boss was, arguably more powerful. He had massive influence. He was one of the most respected members. Even the boss regarded him that way. You wouldn't look at a guy like Johnny Roselli, and he was treated that way with the Chicago family as well, even before he transferred to them. He was a very special figure, you know. So seeing him as just a soldier, because that term brings with it a certain connotation, doesn't really encapsulate what that person can be. And I think he's one of the prime examples, although there are many.
Yeah, we know that when he was transferred to the Chicago family, Roselli was technically you would describe him as a soldato formally, right? He was a member of the under Frankie Laporte, who was the capo di Cina of the Chicago Heights crew, right? So the thing is, what's important is he did report to somebody, right? And it's not that he's getting bossed around by Frankie Laporte, but Frankie Laporte is his superior, not just within a chain of command, because if an order, I mean, sometimes there were orders that came down, right? There were specific things that they weren't instructed to do. There was a chain of command. Like if you were told that there was a contract and somebody had been was supposed to be clipped, and the bosses had said that, the bosses of the family, like the administration, may go to a specific captain and say, I want your guys to take care of this, and then that captain is going to go to his members and say, I'm appointing you guys to go out and take care of this. So in those cases, they weren't micromanaging them for racket operations necessarily, right? Unless they were partners of the same racket operation, that could happen. But they're more like business partners at that point, sort of co-invested or managing a shared enterprise, right? You know, what's important for me too is, so we have the operational organizational, right, or de facto de jure, right, sort of divide. And it doesn't map neatly onto this, but another divide that I think is important, like a set of perspectives you have to account for both of them, is a top-down flow and a bottom-up flow. So the top-down flow is the chain of command, right? And we know that the mafia does have a sort of quasi-military sort of system and terminology, and I think that corresponds to the chain of command, right? Where you have it from a boss to an underboss, maybe to a street boss or some other sort of like liaison between the administration and the captains. The captains, the capi di Cina, right, are modeled on basically squadron or platoon leaders in like a guerrilla army or like a military organization, right? And then you have the soldati. That's the reason why they had that term, right? But then you also have a bottom up, which is not a chain of command; it's a chain of representation. And Angelo has been really, I think, insightful on underscoring this for people, is that the mafia fundamentally is a system of representation, right? So from them up, it's that each person is represented. There's like tiers of representation. So the associates that are on record with a made guy or his captain, I think technically they're on record with the captain if they're an associate of a crew, right? At least that seems to be how it worked in Chicago and I think in other cities. And they're represented, right? They're not members, like they're not like basically not fully part of the family and they don't have a say in it, right? And but they're basically like they're represented by that specific member or his captain, right? The members are then represented by the captain. The captain, right, is represented by the administration. The boss of the family is the rappresentante. He's the representative of the entire family vis-a-vis other families in like the national mafia system. And then we had families like the New York families or Chicago that were avvocati, right? They were, which means advocate or lawyer, right? But that's like a higher tier of representation where they represent the bosses of other families who don't have seats on the commission. So there's a chain of command that goes from the top down, right? And even, if the commission had like a sort of edict that it passed, not that they did this all the time, they didn't micromanage families. The bosses of each family were responsible for administering them. But if the commission decided to say, look, we're going to close the books, no families are going to make guys, they would take a vote on that. And they could then pass through each of the avvocati, right? They would then pass that down to the other families. Those families would then tell their men, right? So there's a chain of command, right? But there's also a chain of representation. where if you have a problem, you have a beef, you have an issue, you're in trouble or something, say you have an issue with a guy in another crew, then your captains have to sit down and work that out. They represent you. If they can't work it out, then it has to get kicked up to the administration, right? And if the whole family has a crisis, it gets kicked up to the commission. Does that
And one
make
of the
sense?
ways,
Yeah.
yeah,
There's a top down and a bottom up, and they're both happening. They're both important.
one of the ways that I view Cosa Nostra membership is it's in a way like being issued a legal license.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you're made, and you now have a license to represent any associates who are on record with you. Your captain has, I don't know, like a higher license, a more advanced license. He can now represent the soldiers under him, in addition to the associates, like Tony was mentioning. And that goes all the way up. And then, but in many ways, a made member is like a licensed lawyer who's allowed to practice Cosa Nostra law. Mm-hmm. And that's a lot of what they spend their time doing. If you actually talk to made members and listen to made members, a lot of their life revolves around representing the people under them and negotiating problems that they're in. It's why I think John Panisi said almost all the headaches in his life came from the associates under him, because he's constantly having to represent them. So in many ways, he is like a legal license. We don't think of gangsters that way, but in that world, that's what they're allowed to do. He's allowed to go to an argumento, as they traditionally called it, what we now call a sit-down, and make those negotiations much like a lawyer does. And sometimes they represent those members. I mean, they really represent them much like a lawyer does. They can do it pro bono, where they're doing it because they believe in it, because they care about that guy. He might be a relative, he might be a friend. They can do it expecting money. These guys sometimes represent guys in sit-downs because they think, if we win the sit-down, I'm going to get a payoff, or I'm going to be able to take some money off this guy. Sometimes there's underhanded stuff that goes on behind the scenes, where they'll make a deal with the guy that they're meeting with from another crew or family, and they'll say, hey, let's make this decision, and then we'll split the money. Mm-hmm. So they're very much like a lawyer. People talk about the consigliere as sort of a lawyer. To me, he's more like the attorney general, whereas everybody under the administration is more like a lawyer in many ways.
Absolutely. One thing I'd like to say is in regards to organization and operation. When it comes to organization, you're only going to put members that went through the full ceremony. It's very black and white. Boss, under, soldier. There's no such thing as a crew boss in the organization. Operationally, anyone that's a member can be a crew boss. But in terms of the organization, there's no distinction between capo di cena and crew boss. When it comes to operational, this is where you look at the groups, the Gambinos or Cleveland or Chicago, as personal entities, and you're going to see people who are not members who carry significant influence in and among these groups. Can't remember his name right now. I'm trying to think about it. The guy from
Whitey Basasti.
Joe Watts.
Okay.
Oh, Joe Watts. Yeah.
Joe Watts would be one. Mace Rockman would be another. And then your guys from Chicago like Gus Alex. These guys are very important members, and the history of these groups cannot be told without going into them. So when we talk about organizational versus operational, it's a pivot. Both of them are very, very important as to what made these groups what they are. When we do organizational charts and we don't include non-Italians on there, in one way it's accurate to not include them, but in another way it's not if you're looking for the big picture. That's why when it comes to all these charts, there could really be an organizational chart versus an operational chart for each family. Organizational, like we said, boss down the soldier. But when it comes to operational, you could have accountants, you could have advisors, you could have a hit team, you could have a personal assist crew bosses. All these components play into the operation that these groups run on. But at the very center core of these operations, you have mafia families.
Yeah, in the same way that a term like soldier is loaded, the way that sounds, the way it comes across, especially if you haven't immersed yourself in it like this, associate is very similar, where when you say somebody's an associate, sometimes people might react and say, well, he was more than an associate, because they think of an associate as the lowest rung, and often it is. But an associate doesn't have any ceiling on them. If an associate has the respect and if the boss puts himself behind an associate, if an associate's on record with a high-ranking member, and the boss sanctions everything he does, well, he could be more influential. He could be operationally more powerful than many of the members. And those examples you cited are great. Joe Watts was that. Gus Alex was certainly that.
Yeah.
And they were associates, though. In terms of the formal organization, they were non-members on record with the family.
Yeah.
It takes nothing away from them, though. And I think that's, because I've had this discussion with people where when you say one of those guys is an associate, they tend to perceive it as you're putting them down a peg. When the reality is, it makes them that much more impressive to me.
Yeah.
These guys were associates, but they had more clout than many of the made members. That's more impressive. Right. That makes their story that much more interesting to me.
And they weren't Italian, so they didn't qualify for membership, not because of their own personal character or ability. They just, there was a glass, it was a brick ceiling, it was a rock ceiling. There was no glass ceiling, right? I mean, they could not, because they didn't have formal membership. There was arenas that they had no access to, right? And in terms of their respect, in terms of their influence over the administration, in terms of how much even made guys respected these guys and listened to them, right? Because they understood if they were basically associates on record and represented by the administration of the family, right? Then when they spoke, they sort of spoke almost as proxies for the administration. If Joe Watts was speaking to somebody, everybody would know this guy is basically licensed personally by John Gotti, right? If Gus Alex was speaking,
examples of that, yeah.
Yeah, if Gus Alex in Chicago was speaking, everybody knew who the fuck he was, right? So even if they're members, right, they're gonna. I mean, it's not like he's able to give them orders as a mafia chain of command would, but they would understand if he says something, or if the bosses, like in the early '70s, it seems like Gus Alex was basically functioning as a liaison because Joey Aiuppa was being installed as the boss, and he was ill. And Accardo wasn't the boss, but he was sort of like the elder statesman or consigliere of the family, right? And he had been the acting boss before that, along with Paul Rica, because Giancana had left the country. There's a whole story to that, right? So people will see this, and they'll kind of, over the years, they've thought that Gus Alex actually had like a formal rank within the family. And there's confidential informants from this period in Chicago that are, they're very explicit. They say Gus Alex is not a member because he's not Italian, and he's reached the highest status he can reach as an associate. And when Chicago had a ruling council made up of the bosses and the some of the sort of older or high status Cappuccino in the family, right? And Gus Alex was, CI stated he cannot actually be a member of this ruling council, but he participates in their meetings when he represented other Greek non-Italian guys who were not members. If those guys had a problem and they needed to be represented to the mafia, Gus Alex did that for them, right? Even though he's not a member, right? It's like all these guys who couldn't be members, but who kind of worked for the mob, right? In crews, like little sub crews, they could be represented by him. And he also represented, specific, and this is operational stuff, not organizational stuff, right? He was in charge of like political corruption, some labor corruption, and that kind of stuff. So Rockman or Joe Watts would be the same sort of person. They were highly respected. They were basically directly on record with the administration of the family. And they had the ears of the people who were running the family. So they had a lot of influence. And everybody would know that. No one on the street would disrespect these guys and say, you're not even a member, I'm sure. No one would dare do that. But if there was like an induction ceremony, people were being brought into the family, they wouldn't be able to be present. There's a story from Angelo Leonardo, I believe, he was the acting boss of the Cleveland family, right? And he flipped and he testified in 1983, the early 1980s. His father, Giuseppe Leonardo, had been boss of the Cleveland family in the 1920s. So he comes from a mafia lineage, Sicilian guy, family from where? From Licata, Agrigento. And so he had been around forever, right? And was the acting boss of the Cleveland family. So it's interesting when you get accounts. We don't get a lot of these accounts directly of how these things worked. And I believe it was Leonardo, when he testified, that said that Misha Rockman, right, who was a Jewish guy who was the brother-in-law of John Scalish, the previous boss, right, of Cleveland, and was highly, highly respected, but wasn't a member formally, right, organizationally, right. But he basically, they had a meeting and a sit down with the Chicago family. Which was represented by Joey Aiuppa, who was the boss, the rappresentante, right. And when Joey Aiuppa, I'm sure very politely, asked Misha Rockman to leave the room. And then Cleveland said, no, we're here talking about Teamsters, about the union stuff. And he's like, oh, okay, come back in. Right.
And
That tells you a lot, actually. Right. That tells you a lot.
With Joe Watts, we have examples like that too, and it comes from Michael DiLeonardo, where Michael was proposed for membership for several years. He'd been proposed by Paul Zacharia, but he hadn't been made yet. He was a young guy waiting his turn. And when Gotti became boss, Joe Watts actually said to Gotti, or one of the leaders, he was like, I think it's time to make Michael. And they did.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that Joe Watts was responsible for Michael becoming a made member. Of course he wasn't. He was going to become a made member anyway. But the fact that Joe Watts was respected enough to where he could tell the leadership of the family, hey, I think it's time to make that guy. Watts himself can't become a member. But the fact that he was able to do that doesn't mean, because you could look at that information and be like, oh, I guess Gotti would just listen to any old associate about who he should make. No way.
Yeah.
Watts was in a position where he had the respect and authority that he could have conversations like that, probably behind closed doors, maybe only with Gotti. He's probably not going to say that in a meeting where there's a bunch of captains there. And another example of that, too, is there was a sit-down in the 90s where there was some kind of dispute, and Joe Watts was involved over the construction industry. And when the family leadership met and Joe Watts was there, he said, John Sr. told me I have carte blanche to do whatever I want in the construction industry. As long as I'm making money for the family,
right,
there's really nothing that can stop me. And everybody in the meeting, which included Junior Gotti, I think there were a couple captains there, they said, you're right. Gotti licensed you.
Yeah,
Gotti used his license as the representante to allow you to do whatever you wanted. And in addition to that, when the Westies were put on record with the Gambino family, who did they report to? Joe Watts. So in a sense, and I think members themselves would say this, in a sense, Joe Watts was like a captain. He had the amount of clout that a captain does. He had the Westies reporting to him. So you have this non-Italian faction that has a lot of influence and power. And these are all very deadly guys.
Yeah.
These guys they probably had more manpower, more firepower among them than a lot of crews have made members.
Sure.
However, they were not members.
Yeah.
Joe Watts was not a Cappuccino.
Yeah.
But he was licensed. And the thing is, if the new leader took over, if somebody took over after Gotti and said, hey, we don't want Joe Watts to have that influence anymore, there might be trouble, but there's nothing he could do about it.
Unless
there's no argument
another member who's able to advocate for him.
Right. And what's important, I think, why Joe Watts is a lot like the Chicago guys in this sense, is that there's continuity between different bosses, where Joe Watts had previously had that relationship with Paul Castellano. There's photos of Joe Watts sitting at Paul Castellano's kitchen table. This guy was in the inner circle. We've heard Joe Watts described identically, where Joe Watts was part of the inner circle, not the member inner circle, but he was a respected peer of these guys. And,
at a personal level.
And so with Gus Alex, my understanding, Tony, you could clarify, my understanding is Gus Alex held the same level of influence as an associate under multiple bosses. Is that right?
Yeah, and he reportedly, according to one CI, was telling this person who was a CI, we don't know who, that he had, he was himself saying, I've reached basically as high up as I can go, but at least I'm the king of the Greeks. So, he was, and there was Greek racketeers that worked closely with Italian outfit guys in Chicago. There was other guys who were not Italian who were mobsters. They were like formally associated with the Chicago family, and they were under them, right? They belonged to them, but they were not members. Like how the Westies reported to Joe Watts. There was guys in Chicago like that. And, so they needed somebody like Gus Alex to represent them to the family's administration if they had a reason to be represented. They were sort of under his protection, and he was under the protection of the administration. And, we only see in Chicago, there was a lot of non-Italian associates, and some of them had real status and real respect on a personal level, right? But Gus Alex, even amongst them, was sort of exceptional, right? And so he really is a comparable figure to Joe Watts. Rockman, in 1976, Cleveland boss John Scalish dies, right, of natural causes. Rockman, who was his brother-in-law and his confidant, and had his ear the way that Alex did in Chicago with the administration, the way that Joe Watts did under two administrations in the Gambino family, right? And they killed Castellano. And it's not like Joe Watts was out. That's an important thing also. It wasn't like a
Joe Watts was a conspirator. Joe Watts was part of the conspiracy, and he seems to have been an important part. They wanted to get his support.
Yeah, because I mean, he was an influential person that had a lot of respect, and so that tells you a lot right there, also, right? But so yeah, when Scalish dies in 1976, it's Misha Rockman that tells the actual family, the actual Cleveland organization, that I mean, it was the wish of John Scalish to have what was it, Jimmy Licavoli become boss, right? And so he's in a
Yeah,
position.
that's
It's not like he's actually issuing an edict. They understand that he's speaking for the now deceased Scalish because he was basically like Scalish's, like when he speaks, it's an extension of Scalish's license or his authority, right? And so that's the same kind of thing. There was a guy in the New England family under Raymond Patriarca Sr. Guy was French Canadian, and there's a lot of those in Canada. So you see them as mob associates, right? Just like in Chicago, you might see Greek and Jewish guys, right? But I can't think of the guy's name right now. It's not Saint Laurent.
So,
William
Uamete?
Met. Yeah, William Met.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we met that guy exactly. And there's FBI files that are based on CI accounts, right? They're not just making this up themselves. People are telling them this in the 60s that say basically this guy's like a de facto Cappuccino. But then they also say he can't be because he's not Italian, he can't be made, but he's treated the same as a Cappuccino, or basically almost like an administration member by Patriarca, who's the boss of the family, right? So he's not organizationally part of the mafia, right? But on a personal level, he's sort of operating under the license of Patriarca, and he has a crew of non-Italian guys who are working under him. And if those guys have a problem with a made guy, otherwise they would have no recourse, right? But now they're not made, and the guy they report to is not made, but he reports directly to the boss. So they might have a beef with a made guy over something, right? They might have an issue with him. If they weren't affiliated with this guy we met, what are they going to do? They have to eat it. If a May guy tells them like I'm going to take something from you, or you can't talk to me that way, they're not going to have any. They might be tough, but if they try to do anything, they can get killed, right? But otherwise, now they can go to their guy we met, who can go to Patriarcha, and then probably have a sit down, right? So
And the
that's
ultimate
yeah,
example, I think the ultimate example, obviously, is Meyer Lansky, where technically, going back to the organizational versus operational thing, organizationally, Meyer Lansky was an associate of the Genovese family. I don't know who he was on record with. I suspect at some point he was put on record with Jimmy Allo. That was his closest friend, and
yeah.
they lived in Florida together,
Maybe
and they
Luciano
were
Morse,
peers.
you know?
But Lansky's the ultimate example because
Yeah.
there was an informant in the garment industry in, I believe, the 1950s who told the FBI how, as far as the hierarchy of who has the most power in the garment industry, Lansky is number one. And this is a guy who worked in the industry. He probably owned or ran a company. He was somebody who knew the lay of the land. He wasn't just anybody. He wasn't a guy sewing dresses. He was somebody who knew what was going on. He said Lansky was by far the most influential and powerful person in the garment industry.
Yeah.
There was another Jewish guy whose name I forget, who he placed as number two. He placed number three as Tommy Lucchese, who we knew was the boss of a family at that time.
Yeah.
You could say maybe he doesn't really know what's going on as far as, he doesn't know what's going on behind the scenes, maybe.
Sure.
I have a tendency to trust him. I think Lansky was the most influential person in that industry. And even though Tommy Lucchese was a boss, as far as the operations of garments, as far as running that business, and controlling it, I think Lansky probably was the most influential, like he said. It doesn't mean that Lansky is going to do anything against Lucchese. He's going to respect his position. I imagine they were working together
Yeah.
in every possible way. And he's going to respect the fact that Tommy Lucchese is a rappresentante of the mafia, that
And he knows what
Lansky
that
himself
means.
is.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Lansky's very
exactly.
familiar with how the mafia operates, even though all these guys should be underscored also. All of those guys, even though they weren't privy to certain meetings and to certain ceremonial functions and certain business that was direct to the actual mafia secret society organization, and they weren't technically supposed to know things. You have to imagine that they were told a lot of things
Yeah.
off the right. So they had a lot. They had decades of experience of working with the mafia and understood it and it ethos probably better than a lot of members, right?
And to show you how important Lansky was,
Yeah.
Tony knows where I'm going to go with this. There was a wiretap of Tony Accardo. I can't remember who else was there, but I believe it was Tony Accardo. Was it Gene Connor?
Because Giancana was on the commission at that time.
Okay.
Ricardo
It was
wasn't the boss anymore. He was a
right.
retired boss. Yeah.
Yeah, so it was Gene Connor and Tony Accardo talking about commission activities.
Mhm.
And I believe it's Accardo or one of them who says, I heard they made the Jew an avocat. And earlier you mentioned that position, avocado, which is a term for commission members who represent other families. Avocado is literally the not not to be confused with the food, but avocado literally is used as lawyer in Italy.
Yeah.
An avocado, an advocate. That's the term for lawyer in Italy. They would use that for commission members, which shows you the legal terminology that was in use.
Yeah.
But they were saying they made the Jew an avogad, which Tony and I discussed this, in the last couple of years, and we were initially confused because it was in reference to Lansky, and we were like, you had to be a made member, you had to be a boss to sit on the commission.
Yeah.
Are they using this figuratively? Are they using this metaphorically? Obviously, Lansky was.
Is Ricardo joking when he's saying we don't know the context?
We don't know. That's the thing. When we're reading transcripts, we don't know the tone. We don't know if they're making a crack. But then I found a report more recently from Frank Bompensero, who I consider the Nicola Gentile of his era in terms of his connections and his knowledge.
Absolutely.
And Frank Bompensero told the FBI the exact same thing. He said, Meyer Lansky, he's not an actual commission member, but he's like one. And he represents the organized Jewish element in national organized crime. So Lansky didn't sit on the commission. He was not an avogad in the sense that everybody else was. Yeah. But the commission members themselves saw Lansky as a peer over the Jewish element. And that just tells you everything. That I said earlier, there's no ceiling on what an associate can be. Lansky was an associate, but that doesn't mean he's a guy, picking up numbers every day. Lansky is such an important associate that he is seen as a peer of the commission. He's not going to be allowed to sit in on commission meetings where they discuss policy and that sort of thing, but bosses will sit down with him and he can talk about what his interests are, how he can help them. And Lansky was not a rival of the mafia. He was part of the greater infrastructure that made the mafia what it was.
Yep, 100%. And it's we've talked about this too, and it's like at a greater level, or at a different level of organization, right? And we've talked about this. If people know like Hermetic philosophy, the principle is as above, so below. The tarot card with the magician where he's going like this, right?
And the microcosm and the macrocosm. Yep.
Yeah, and we see this with like the chain of representation, right? Each tier is represented by somebody who is sort of higher up on the scale of organization. And, so we have a guy like Lansky that functions as an avogado, right? Direct to the, basically with the commission, right? He's treated as a de facto commission member for specific things that have to do with the people that he represents to them. One of those guys, one of these Jewish guys, it could be in California, it could be in New York. If they have a problem with a member of the mafia and they need to have that ironed out, they can appeal to Lansky. And Lansky, on a personal level, can then appeal to the commission, and say, look, I mean, if he can't iron it out with the boss of the family, right? He can then go to the commission, and the commission can then say, we'll get this worked out, Gus Alex, this is exactly the way the Gus Alex is described in Chicago by that CI that said he's not a member of the family. He can't be because he's not a member and he's not Italian, but he participates in some of their meetings. He represents non-Italian to them and specific operational stuff that has to do with political corruption, which is what his sort of leisure domain was, right? So it's exactly the way that Lansky is operating at a higher level of organization with the commission nationally, right? For Jewish gangs who are represented by him, right? In Chicago, Gus Alex is the king of the Greeks, right?
And going back to what Angelo said a minute ago about how you chart this, because, for those unfamiliar, Angelo makes these very impressive, detailed, incredibly well-researched charts. They're better than the FBI charts, I'll say that, and at least the historic ones.
Definitely.
And when you're charting this, if you're making a chart of the formal mafia organization, Lansky shouldn't be on there. Let's go with the commission. Let's say you want to make a chart of the formal commission during a certain era. You're not going to put Lansky on there because he didn't actually have a commission seat. Lansky was not an amico nostra. He was not a member of the mafia. He was not a rappresentante. Yep. That said, he doesn't belong on the chart. That said, you can't tell the story of the commission without Lansky. So this making the distinction between organizational and operational, it's not an attempt to denigrate these guys who were very important and played a very important role in Cosa Nostra, around Cosa Nostra. It's just making a formal distinction, because when a lot of people write about this, they'll just say a guy's a capo. They'll just say a guy is a boss. They'll say a guy is this or that. And I know where they're coming from, but for us as people who are really trying to accurately detail the history of this, there is a difference. And they know it. The members know it. When the FBI had confidential informants and interviewed them, the members knew, they had an acute awareness of who was an Amica Nostra and who wasn't. They had to know it. Their life depended on it. They had to be constantly aware. So it's not that we're being, hard asses about this and being like, oh, but he was actually this. We're not trying to do that at all. We're just saying this is how they see it. This is what their organization is. This isn't our theory. This is Cosa Nostra's own system.
Yeah, and so people have misread Chicago because there's been a lot of really important non-Italian associates over the years, because these guys were very useful to the mafia. They had a lot of status and respect as mobsters in their own right. And like Lansky was with some people in the Genovese family, and it appears in Chicago also because he traveled there a lot from what I understand. They were personal friends also of each other, right? And respected each other. Or like Gotti and Joe Watts, right? Or Rockman and Scalish. They were brothers-in-law. But when we actually have an account, the 2007 Family Secrets trial of a made member of the Chicago family, and he's being cross-examined about this by the prosecutors, I believe. And when it's a prosecution, Mitch Mars, and they ask him, they're asking him about like what it means to be a made member, and he's like, he says the word secret society. He's like, you belong to the secret society, right? And then they're like, was there a similar status accorded to non-Italians? And he just goes, no. He doesn't, and this is a person that when he was made in '83, Gus Alex was still very much present. He didn't bring up Gus Alex, he didn't bring up Irv Weiner, he didn't bring up Lenny Patrick, and all these guys, guys that were Italian non-members who had a lot of clout, who had non-member crews working under them, right? No, he just said, nope.
And there have been some interesting situations too. An example is John Veazey in Philadelphia, who, as far as we know, was only maternally Italian.
I have a question. I think his father could have been part Italian himself, because there was Veazeys that intermarried with Italians. I just don't know if that was the same Veazey family. There was more than one Veazey family in South Philly.
And we also have to figure the family was in shambles at that time. John Stamper was doing whatever he could to get any loyalty from anybody. Yeah. And then another example, I'm not too familiar with him, but Chucky Porter of Pittsburgh, wasn't he only half Italian on his mother's side? I don't actually know.
Because, a lot of guys anglicize their names. Some of them did that. Sometimes you have mafia members who did that. They didn't want notoriety to like reflect on their family. Or in some cases, they did this a lot in Chicago, is they would use non-Italian names as aliases, so they would be less identifiable as Italian, so they wouldn't be suspected as much. Or sometimes their families did it just because of Americanization. Their grandparents might have done it when they first came from Italy.
And let's just say if these guys
was just an anglicized version of an Italian name, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know enough about him, but let's just say that the mafia has on a couple occasions inducted guys who are only half Italian on their mother's side. Those are completely exceptional in every possible way. They represent I don't even know if they wouldn't even represent a single percentage point in the greater landscape of mafia membership.
Yeah.
And I want to kind of transition too into the operations themselves, the actual activities. Because people, and I want Angelo usually has some great analogies with this stuff. There's a tendency to view the mafia through its operations. I mean, that goes back to the perception that these were bootlegging gangs who organized around bootlegging. The mafia has its networks and sub-networks, and we talked in the previous episode about how those were largely formed on these Sicilian relationships, hometowns, kinship, interrelation. Those networks expanded when they came to the U.S., and they used those networks for their operations. The Morello counterfeiting operation, they used an existing network they already had. They didn't create a new network. They got new nodes in the network through making connections to guys in different cities, non-Sicilians, non-Italians. But at its core, they were using an existing network for that. When alcohol was made illegal, they started using their existing network. They didn't form new networks to manufacture and distribute illegal alcohol. They used their existing network to do that while expanding it through those new relationships. But the core network existed. And so the mafia wasn't based on one specific criminal operation when it formed. It wasn't like, hey, we're bootleggers, guys. We're going to get together and make a formal organization around the activity of bootlegging. Because once bootlegging's over, guess what's still there? Cosa Nostra. And they're focused on other things.
Yep. And they use those networks to take over, organized labor union locals. They use them to sort of organize gambling syndicates, but like when counterfeiting was the primary racket of the mafia, it was the mafia in essence, by definition, was not a counterfeiting syndicate. When bootlegging was the main racket a lot of guys were doing because there was a lot of money in it, it was not a bootlegging alcohol syndicate. When it was gambling or narcotics or whatever other things came about later on that were big money makers, the mafia organized syndicates using its network. So it would create organized crime syndicates, but those are not the same thing as the mafia, right? Those syndicates could take place within those organizational, network, ties. Yeah.
You do have organizational, which is the ranks we already went into down to the bottom. But then you have operational, which is people who are not formal members of this, but very much play an integral part of it. You do have a Chicago mafia and you do have a Chicago outfit or organization or whatever you want to call it, which is going to include guys who never went through the ceremony. But you can't say with a straight face that Gus Alex wasn't part of the Chicago outfit, or that Joe Watts wasn't a Gambino, or that Mice Rockman wasn't with Cleveland. I mean, they were. They just weren't formal Mykonos. And it's a pivot. You got the organization, you got the operation, and they're both very important components of this. And when it comes to certain groups that we don't really know a lot about, and we try to speculate, we try to watch from the outside. I mean, let's say we're all members and Eric owns a store. Tony's a Cappuccino. I'm, we'll say, underboss in this example, but Eric's got the good store. And we're working there because he's just an amazing store. Well, FBI or anybody else looking in, they're going to see that and think, wow, Eric's giving orders to Tony and Angelo. So Eric's got to be operational boss or secret boss or whatever. No, this is an organization. This is an operational thing. If we all get called to a family meeting, I'm going there as the under, Tony is a captain, Eric is a soldier. And it's very clear to these people, to their insiders. At the end of the day, it is their organization. We as outsiders don't get to give them ranks of what we think they should be. There's very important people in that world that do not want to hold a position. They don't want to be a captain. They're not seeing it as, I don't want to be a crime boss. They're seeing it as, I don't want to be a representative of other people. I don't want to assume their headaches into my stuff.
And a concrete example of what you just laid out is with Jimmy Burke, who deserves to be mentioned here. Everybody knows who Jimmy Burke is. I think there's a movie that has him in it. I forgot what it's called. But Jimmy Burke, he was a big deal. Technically, organizationally, he was a Colombo associate who then moved to the Lucchese family. He had very close relationships with all of the top guys in that Ozone Park, Howard Beach area. One of his best friends, who isn't in Goodfellas, I remember the name, but one of his best friends who isn't in Goodfellas was Vinny Acero, who his great-grandfather was a member in Castellamare del Golfo who came to the U.S. The Aceros, we don't even know how far back they go. I mean, they really are the mafia's aristocracy. But they were business partners in restaurants. They shared partnerships in illegal activities. They committed murders together. An interesting detail, though, is that Jimmy Burke was one of the biggest loan sharks around.
Yeah.
Vinny Acero actually, if you look at it purely through the operational lens, he was actually a subordinate of Jimmy Burke's loan sharking business. He borrowed money from Jimmy Burke. He paid a vig. And if you were to walk in, if you didn't know what Cosa Nostra was, and you were just to see that as an outsider, you would say, oh, Jimmy Burke is the boss. Jimmy Burke is he's the guy who Vinny Acero reports to. No, he has a resource that, Vinny Acero apparently had a bad gambling problem and stuff. He probably wasn't very good at money. Maybe it was better to just borrow money from Jimmy Burke's operation. They were friends. It made sense. It's not like as a made member, Vinny Acero is going to muscle in and be like, oh, this guy's not made. I'm going to take his loan sharking operation over. No, that was his friend, and him borrowing money from Jimmy Burke and essentially being a subordinate of that operation took nothing away from Vinny Acero as a Bonanno member. And it didn't make Jimmy Burke more than what he was. But again, it shows you that there's nothing stopping an associate from being in that position. And if Jimmy Burke was a made member, I have no doubt that he would have been a higher ranking member.
But
But
if he could have been a made member, he would have been. He probably would have been a captain or a boss, the same as these other
right,
guys we're talking about.
yeah,
And everybody knew that they couldn't be. It's different than like a full-blooded Italian guy that no one ever makes because the guy is seen as a fucking stenot, right? He's seen as, or whatever. He just doesn't, for whatever reason, he doesn't qualify for membership or he gets passed up or something. You have guys who are associates for, for decades who never get made, right? Some of these guys are just kind of like, hard-headed criminals. Some of them are, they're just not, the mafia is actually very selective. It's not like a street gang that makes a bunch of foot soldiers and that kind of stuff, right? It's very selective. You're entering the ranks of an elite secret society. That's how they see themselves. That's what they are, right? So a guy like Jimmy Burke, who can't become a member, right, is not. I mean, everyone's going to know that he's not a member, and that makes a difference in some contexts. In other contexts, it doesn't, right? And they're going to understand also, like, this guy is like, this guy's a true fucking gangster and highly respected. And compared to some guy who might be Italian, but the guy might be an idiot. It's not like he didn't, because of personal character, he couldn't qualify for membership. It just was not. It's a non-starter with him.
right.
Everybody would have known this. If this guy had been a member, yes, he would have not just been a soldier, he would have been something higher. He was very capable
If
and
I
was the kind of person that had that sort of respect at a personal level, right?
if I may say something, going back to the early days with counterfeiting and whatnot, it was very much the same way that you guys are describing, like the situation between Asaro and Jimmy Burke. This was not mafia coming in saying, all right, we're going to do things this way. What you had was individual members networking and getting involved with, other people involved in the same industries, be it counterfeiting, be it running a produce store, whatever industry, illegal or non, you're into, you're going to meet other people within this industry. And
Yeah.
depending on who you make friends with, the network expands.
Very true.
Yeah, when it came to counterfeiting, by the 1910s, you had multi-ethnic coalitions of counterfeiters, Italian, Jews, Irish, whatever. They were all working in tandem, in some cases working in the same, what you want to call, counterfeiting outfit. I didn't get the impression that the made guy was walking in there saying, okay, guys, I'm taking over this. Let me tell you how it's done. No, they were coming in as partners or as part of an endeavor. They weren't coming in to take it over. And that's the thing about mafia is we tend to think of it as a collective whole when actually it's a bunch of individual members going out and doing their own thing. In the history of the mafia, there's very few names where people get the bulk credit for everything,
Yeah.
and it's accurate. Like Luciano didn't Americanize the mob. The concept of that is just mind boggling. But he is part of a process or a trend that was going on. And the same can be said for counterfeiting and things of that nature. In the 1900s, it was majority birds of a feather. But then come 1910s, you then have a few Irishmen, a few Jews popping up in these counterfeiting groups. And when you go back to counterfeiting, I mean, when you look at the racket itself, you had to get people that knew chemistry, that knew how to dye stuff, that had like little quirks for you use this chemical and then you take the note and you rub it in dirt and it gives it that feel.
Yeah, and if a guy was Jewish or Anglo-American and one of these Sicilian guys had access to him, knew him, and was like personally close to him, they would use these people. They would work together. They
Absolutely.
weren't, and if there was a guy who was like, I'm not going to work with that guy because he's not one of us. I mean that wouldn't have been very fit evolutionarily, right? I mean,
Absolutely, yeah.
yeah.
Those
I mean,
guys were the
if there were
exception.
guys, yeah,
The guys that are like, oh, I'm not going to deal with anyone but my hometown. I mean, they existed, but they were the exception. And
yeah.
had they been dominant, we wouldn't still be talking about this phenomenon.
It would have died out after the first generation. It never would have sunk its roots into the American soil,
Exactly.
And
And you just, sorry.
yeah,
I was going to
say
say,
counterfeiting. Go ahead, Eric. Yeah, go ahead.
well, I was just going to say, as kind of a side note about all this too, I think we also have to push away the idea that the mafia, even within its own organization, among its made members, is constantly ordering guys to commit certain crimes or participate in certain operations. You know, a Cappuccina doesn't say to a member, "Hey, I want you to go get involved in this, whatever it is, this hijacking ring. I want you to go, take over this bookmaking operation." If it's a guy who's already involved in that, the Cappuccina might lay it out and say, "Hey, we have an opportunity to invest in this card, this floating craps game, whatever it is. I'd like you to get involved." And if the member says no, he might lose some amount of respect or standing. He's not going to be punished for it. There's no criminal quota that says if you're made, you have to do this. They take an oath to commit murder when asked and to not do certain things, but there's no rule that says if you're initiated into the mafia, you have to be a bootlegger, you have to be a thief, you have to be a gambler. They make those guys, and if you're already that class of member, and there's different classes of members, which we can get into another time, going back to Sicily, but if you're that class of member, a hoodlum, chances are you're already involved in that stuff already. Your Cappuccina isn't going to force you to get involved in it. And, along those lines too, we have members who didn't come from that sort of life. They didn't come from that sort of background. A good example is a guy in the Bonanno family. They had two doctors, practicing physicians, who were still members as of the 60s, and I think they lived for a while longer. One of them was Joe Bonanno's cousin, Dr. Martin Bonventuri. Another one was Dr. Mario Tagliagambi, whose uncle had been killed in an early mafia war. They were legitimate working professionals. Bonventuri was the head of a hospital in Brooklyn.
Brooklyn Hospital Center, I believe.
Yep, exactly. And Tagliagambi was a physician as well.
Yep.
Those guys aren't going to get ordered, "Hey, you're a made member, you better go, oversee a crew of associates who are going to rob this truck. Oh, hey, you're a made member, I'm forcing you to go gamble." That guy brought with him certain resources, not just not just pulling out bullets in the middle of the night, so the guy doesn't have to go to a hospital, but having a doctor who's a member in the organization, along with referring members to that doctor for actual, the same reasons anybody would go to a doctor. It also brought with it a certain social status. That guy's going to have connections you wouldn't know. You're not going to force that guy to get into illegal operations just because he's a made member. In fact, you'd probably advise him not to, if anything.
Yeah.
And so that's an important part of this too, is just that the mafia doesn't require anybody. There's no criminal quota. And if somebody's already involved in that, the mafia wants to control and be involved in crime, but it doesn't force its members to do that by default.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a couple examples I can think of that sort of revolve around some of the stuff we're bringing up, just to kind of go back to sort of also like primary source accounts, right? This is stuff that, well, in one case it does appear in a book, but no one has the book because it's out of print, right? For the most part. But some other stuff is coming from primary source documents, like from FBI files, right? So there's, as opposed to the image we get from The Sopranos, where Chrissy is made into he's made into the DeMeo family, and he's a soldier in the DeMeo family. He reports to Paulie Walnuts, and Paulie forces him to kick up a certain set amount every week, and if not, somehow, even though we've already seen it was a huge deal when Tony put his hands on a made guy and punched him, right, and beat him up. I don't know, but then also we're supposed to believe that Chris is in real danger if he doesn't kick up enough to Paulie on a weekly basis, right? Even though we've already been told they can't touch a mate guy, right? I don't know if that happened before or after, but you see what I mean? That's kind of like a little bit of a sort of a tension, right? That doesn't make any sense. But, this idea that we get that he's being terrorized by Paulie, or hazed basically, when he comes in, and like Paulie's like, "You better have my money if you don't do this." And it didn't, maybe there were examples of something sort of similar, but like guys didn't kick up a set amount, they kicked up a percentage. And it's basically, it's like they're taking a cut for the fact that you're able to work with a license within their network, right? So in some cases they may take a cut, but it's not going to be like, you have to pay me $10,000 a week. It's going to be, how much did you make this week off of like whatever operation you have. And it might not be your if you have a hot dog stand, if you did that through your own money and you're not like partnered with another made guy or a captain, that could, maybe in different cases, maybe they might take a cut if it's, I think if it's part of a sort of mafia operated business. But if it's not, that may be your own money and that's your own thing, right? But other things that you do, you're doing it because you're a member of the mafia. You have a juice loan racket or a gambling ring or something, right? And you also, so you may be kicking up a percentage essentially as a gratuity or something, right? For the ability to operate, right? So you're keeping the network afloat. It's also like paying dues almost, right? But then there's also a lot of these cases where it seems like guys are kicking up. What's happening is the bosses or the captains of the family are often provided the actual investment capital to get these things up and running in the first place. So when you're a member, it's like instead of being an employee of one of these racket operations, you now get to become a partner with the captain or the boss, right? And
Right.
some of these high level associates also have the same status where they're essentially partners. Look at a guy like Jimmy Burke, right? Um, this guy, he had his own operation, right? But this guy is doing something at a really high level. He's not a worker for a main guy. But we see, so like there's an early 1970s Chicago member informant of Sicilian ancestry that we've talked about. And this guy in the early 1970s, around 1970, 71, he was giving information to the FBI. It's very interesting because his family goes back to the mafia in Sicily, so he has a very interesting perspective on it. And, he doesn't explicitly say this is how the outfit is set up, but he says that guys like the bosses of the family and the high-ranking elder members like Accardo, Rica, who at that time were basically the acting bosses, Giancana before that, who had been the official boss until he fled the country, that they were rich and they didn't need or want to take money from illegal operations. They were invested in business ventures and they had sort of like high level racket operations that they were personally like invested in with like friends of theirs. They weren't taking, it's not like you were like, you better give up this much money to Joe Batters or someone's going to come and break your legs as a member. This guy said they weren't even taking money from the illegal operations. And he also said that the outfit, the family had not prohibited narcotics, but that a lot of the older members didn't need the money and they stayed away from it because it was hot. But they did not and could not prohibit the members from engaging in narcotics trafficking, even though the older guys didn't want to have anything to do with it. He's like they also don't need the money. The young guys don't have as much money and they need it. But that tells you it's like they're not even telling these guys you can't operate in a certain racket. They have the freedom to do that. They're like independent operators to a degree.
I love that Sopranos. I want to revisit. I'm not going to let that Sopranos example get away. Maybe a bigger Sopranos nerd can tell me I'm wrong, but my understanding of that scenario is that Christopher was put in charge of an existing gambling operation, and like you said, it was something that the family had already invested money into.
Right.
It wasn't a venture that Christopher had started, and they were saying you have to give us this from from the operation. It was something that he was giving them a return on their investment. Right. Where I think the Sopranos got that wrong, though, is the idea that Paulie's like, I need 5,000 and that's it. And Christopher has to go rob to make up for that. The reality of that situation, I've actually seen this play out on wiretaps. I saw it on the Ray DiCarlo tapes in the 60s in New Jersey, Genovese family captain. A lot of what they talk about are these sorts of the inner workings of like how these operations get set up, how they're managed, what happens when they're not doing well. Ray DiCarlo, he never punishes guys when an operation starts losing money. He's like, maybe we need to pull ourselves out. Maybe we need to reinvest somewhere else. It's never about like, hey, you're running that operation for me and I want 5,000 a week. When they start losing money, they might do an investigation to see if that's true. They want to make sure the member is telling the truth. Like, this guy's saying they're losing money. We need to go check out and see if that's actually happening. If it is actually happening, he's not going to demand the same amount of money they were making from that member.
Yep.
They're going to do something else. They're going to pull out of the operation, pull out of the partnership. So that Sopranos example, I mean, it's the Sopranos. It's my favorite show of all time. It'd be very easy to go through and nitpick every little thing, but I think that did kind of create a mythology around like what kicking up is. Sometimes guys do have to kick up a certain percentage of money from any operation they do, just like a flat amount.
That's a percent. That's different. It's a different concept.
Yeah, the percentage. Yep, the percent. And
in Chicago, that they have to do anywhere from 10 to 50%, but it's unclear. Is that any money-making operation, or is it only things that are considered part of the family, sort of like corporate business, essentially?
Something too that I've heard is that certain families don't require a member to kick up profits from his loan sharking operation if it's his own money. Whereas if he's borrowing from the family's loan shark bank, which families often have, I know the Bonanno family still has one as of just a few years ago, it came out. The Colombo family in the 60s had a family loan sharking bank, and members who were borrowing from that, of course, had to pay up a percentage, a VIG or whatever. usually a very favorable one.
Yeah.
It's designed to generate money for everybody.
Yeah, they're going to
But
charge you less points than they're going to charge, a civilian or an associate, right?
right, but
Yeah.
there are many instances though I've heard of where if a guy like has a legitimate business and he decides to start loaning out money, and that's from his own his own resources, the family isn't going to say, oh hey, you're loan sharking, give me some of that. They might do that to an associate. This doesn't apply to associates necessarily, although it can. They can be fairly liberal with how associates operate. And just real quick about that idea of representation being one of the primary roles, something that we've learned really only over the last few years is the Bonanno family didn't require tribute as just a catch-all rule. And he started out as a Bonanno associate, but he became a Gambino associate later. But Pete Zucchero, I think his name was, and he was on record with Frank Bonamo, who was an old-time Castello Marais Bonanno member. Pete Zucchero, he was a hoodlum. Like he robbed for a living. He was a tough guy. He said he never paid a dime to Frank Bonamo, who I think was in his 70s. He might have been pushing 80. He said, however, when he had a problem, Frank Bonamo would sit down on his behalf and represent him. He said there was only one time where Frank asked him, like, oh, I heard you did a score. And he didn't ask for any money. He just said, I just wanted to know if you did that score. And he felt like he was hinting maybe he wanted some of it, but he was willing to represent this guy. He never paid him a dime, and he represented him. He saw a kid that he probably saw as a viable recruit. This guy was never made, but he saw him potentially as a viable recruit and thought like, hey, I'm going to represent this kid. Never took any money. Sal Vitale said when he got put on record with the Bonannos, he gave Messino 50% of everything he made just out of respect because Messino brought him in, but he said it was not a rule. Some other Bonanno members have said that as well. They were never expected to pay. It was the only time they were expected to pay tribute was Christmas and the boss's birthday. But even then, it's not like you're going to be shelved or punished if you don't do that. You're probably going to lose favor. But that's different than being punished organizationally.
Well, much more recent example is Anthony Aruleta, who's been on a bunch of shows, including one of our friend shows, the the Original Gangsters podcast with Scott Bernstein and Jimmy Buccellato. He's a very articulate and he was very successful in that life. He was an associate, then a member, and then captain of the Genovese family's Springfield, Massachusetts crew, which is almost like its own little sub family, right? Because it has its own territory and sort of operates. It's not autonomous, right? But they have, Aruleta refers to the captain as like the boss of the area, right? The captain of that crew, and he says when he was an associate, he had a really successful, really lucrative marijuana distribution operation, and he was on record as an associate with Al Bruno, right, who became the captain of that crew after this guy Frankie Frankie Skyball, and that I believe he said he wasn't kicking anything up from the marijuana operation because that was his own, and he wasn't kicking anything up to the main guy he was on record with. And then he also said, and he was, again, an associate, then a member, then a captain. He said that the Springfield crew of the Genovese family was not giving any money to, as he put it, the bosses in New York. This wasn't a cash cow for the Genovese family. So it's like what you're left with is the impression that this was mostly a representational sort of political association. He said they weren't giving any money to them. They weren't kicking up stuff, to New York. And I'm going to believe that he's in a position to know that,
Well,
So
and while
it
you're
goes against what people think, when they talk about the Sopranos. Again, it's a pyramid scheme since time immemorial. Shit goes down and money goes up, right?
right, and that reminds me of I'm opening up a whole can of worms here. But it's on the subject of remote crews and the Bonannos.
Yeah.
The Canada crew, the Montreal crew. There's this whole, I would call it a mythology because we don't really know what's actually going on organizationally. It's always been extremely painful to try to get any organizational info out of what goes on in Canada. That's true for the Buffalo branch in Hamilton as well as what goes on in Montreal.
Right.
I'm willing to say like we don't really know what's going on. I don't know what's going on. But as far as we know, the made members there were either made into the Bonanno family or the Sicilian mafia.
Right.
And they were represented by the Bonanno family. And knowing what we know now, the Bonanno family only asked for Christmas tribute, really.
Right. That's
we've
interesting.
learned because one of the stories that went into Montreal breaking off was like, oh, they're no longer giving any money to New York, this and that, and then Don, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Tricale, he was a Bonanno captain who flipped. He actually said that they were still not only still demanding tribute for Christmas from Montreal, but they actually asked for more money around 2005, 2006, and Montreal reluctantly but did give it to them. And I think Canada is a good example of where the organizational versus operational gets confused because I have nothing but respect for the journalists and law enforcement who have investigated what goes on in Montreal. They've done far more work than I've ever done, to say the least. I've gotten so much information from them. But I think they kind of push back on the idea that this is just a Bonanno Decina, and they tend to frame it as like the guy there is the boss of his own organized crime family. And we have no information that they've ever been given recognition as such. We have no concrete information that they've ever formally broken off. As far as we know, if you're initiated into Cosa Nostra in Montreal, you're a Bonanno member. If that changes, I'm happy to amend my view, but based on precedent, that's the way it is. But I understand the idea that operationally, Montreal is a lush organized crime kingdom, and that the guys who are made members there, whether they're part of the Sicilian mafia, because we know there's a Sicilian mafia faction there, we know the Ndrangheta is there, we know bikers are there, and they have their own networks there. What they're doing there is probably more impressive than any crew in the U.S. And operationally, I think you could see them as a distinct organized crime entity that has little to do with the Bonanno family.
Yeah.
I would never make that argument otherwise.
Yeah.
But where the organizational comes in is, as far as we know, those guys were initiated into the Bonanno family. If there are any Bonanno members left, we don't know. But I think that's where some of the debate comes from around Montreal. And interestingly, of course, two of the hottest topics that provoke the most debate among researchers are Chicago and Montreal. What do they have in common? Very few inside sources who can tell us about the inner workings of the organization. So a lot of what people observe in those locations are operational relationships, where the operational relationships in Chicago are like, look at Gus Alex, look at these guys who aren't made members. Clearly, they're not just associates or just this or that. Same with Montreal. This guy's not just a Capodicina. These guys aren't just soldiers. They have a lot more going on. But it's important to say, if we're trying to accurately track Cosa Nostra in this organization, we do have to make a distinction. And just to finish this thought, you can see that the way Canadian law enforcement, the RCMP investigates this, they tend to frame the organizations around the operations. A good example of that is they were saying for years, and might still be saying, there's a Lupino Violi crime family in Hamilton.
Right.
Well, an investigation came out where we found out Domenico Violi is the underboss of the Buffalo family.
Yeah.
And his uncles, the Lupinos, one of them's a Capodicina in the Buffalo family.
Yep.
Some of the guys around them were initiated into the Buffalo family. So I totally understand where they're coming from on an operational level, that the Lupinos and Violis, while they might have some sort of relationship business-wise, we don't know, with guys across the border, as far as what they're doing in Hamilton, they are functionally their own organized crime entity. We don't know where that begins and ends, but as soon as we got wiretaps, as soon as we got a made member informant there, we found out, no, they're not the Lupino Violi crime family. As far as family affiliation goes, they're Buffalo members. It takes nothing away from what they are. It takes nothing away from their network and their relationships. But if we want to talk about this accurately, they're members of the Buffalo family.
Yeah, we want to understand these things, all this stuff. It's not about taking guys down a notch or something, or sort of like saying that these guys, aren't important, that the operational stuff isn't important, that angle doesn't tell us anything about how things work. Like Angelo said earlier, if you want to tell the story of the mafia, you have to also encompass all of these things that would fall under the operational rubric, right? But it's about contextualizing them and understanding them. So people like a Joe Watts or a Gus Alex, to me, are all the more remarkable because, or Meyer Lansky, right? It's not that these guys were nobodies, that they were lackeys because they weren't members. That was an important distinction organizationally, and that was a distinction that would be salient in some contexts and not in others. Like where, again, with Joey Ayupa telling Rockman to leave the room, and then they're like, "Oh no, we're talking about Teamster stuff," and he's like, "Come on back in." It wasn't disrespect to Rockman. And Rockman would have known too. There's things I'm not privy to. He would have been well aware. It wouldn't have been insulting. That's well aware to him. He's not part of that inner circle of that fraternity in a formal sense. You know, there's
You should, you
yeah.
should, with that in mind, just with that exact thought in mind, you should comment on the Teddy DeRose induction stuff because that's directly relevant to what you just said.
Yeah. Well, Theodore DeRose, Teddy DeRose, he was a longtime Chicago associate of the outfit. He was a Jewish guy. I believe his parents were from France, and so hence the DeRose, right? Which DeRosa is a common Italian surname. A lot of Napolitan have that. You see a bunch of them in Chicago. Oftentimes they'll go by DeRose because that's how you would actually say it in Napolitan, and they sort of anglicize it with the e at the end. So he has an Italian seeming surname because he's a French Jew. That's my understanding. He comes to Chicago from New York in the 1920s, and he's there as an associate for almost 40 years. He's a really long-term associate. He works with a bunch of guys, Italian and Jewish, and he essentially passes. He says this too. He tells the FBI he gets busted for narcotics, for heroin trafficking with a bunch of guys in Chicago. And then in the early 1960s, he agrees to function as a CI after that, right? Guys are under duress oftentimes when they do this for different reasons. It could be that they're on the hot seat with the family or something pissed them off, or it could be that they're facing a case or something, right? And they want to cooperate to some degree. So he never took the stand and testified, but he gave a lot of information. So even though he wasn't Italian and he wasn't a member, people thought he was Italian, and he passed as Italian. He let them believe that because it was apparently better for his career, which tells you that even as an associate, aside from your Gus Alexes of the world, if you were considered one of us and one of our blood, right, one of our people, they would, still look at you differently, even if you weren't a formal member, right? That tells us that. And then he was in a position, even as a non-member, to know things because people probably confided a little bit more in him than they would somebody if they actually knew that his parents were Jews from France, right? And they told him apparently a number of different things. He knew things about the history of the family in Chicago going back to the 1920s. It's very interesting. He has an historical perspective. He's aware of which administration members are Sicilian and not, which is interesting. It tells you that's kind of stuff that people in Chicago were talking about and thinking about. And he talks about the actual formal organization. He says that when guys are made, he uses the term made. He calls it the life. He says when guys are made into the life, um, they're sponsored by somebody who's already a member. That they're made in a ceremony, and he describes the ceremony as a banquet where they take an oath of loyalty to the family. And now we don't know if this involved. Later in Chicago there absolutely was a full blood and fire mafia traditional ceremony. Some people think there wasn't in Chicago. I think it's hard to say because we just don't have a lot of clear accounts. He wouldn't have been able to go to one of these, so he wasn't. I don't think we can say that's all that happened because these happened behind closed doors. But we can say at least that much happened. It was a formal ceremonial affair, whether they pricked the guy's finger or
It
not,
was a
right? They had a
banquet.
banquet.
At the very least, it was a banquet.
It was a banquet, and you did a formal oath of loyalty to the family. And they said that the non-Italians were not allowed to that, right? But after the banquet, those guys would wait outside the closed doors, and then after that, they would have like a party where those guys would then, you know, they're not formally introduced as Amico Nostra, but I'm sure they would have had to understand if they're important associates. This guy's made now. They would have to understand that his status means something to them, right? Because they have to know who's made also in order to navigate and work right themselves. So that's very interesting. So he's able to give us that sort of account, and he also tells us something about the way that the actual organizational setup goes. That once you're made, your sponsor is responsible for you, and we know in Chicago, at least from Nick Calabrese's account, when he was made, that the sponsors all seem to be captains, right? It's possible maybe soldiers sponsored guys, but we don't really seem to see that in Chicago. Um, and that if a guy who was made had a dispute with another member of the family, it would go to his sponsor, which you can assume was his captain, right? And if that guy's captain couldn't work it out with the captain of the other member, it would then go to what he called the board of directors of the ruling council for arbitration. So he had a lot of insight for somebody who was a non member. and him passing as Italian and people thinking he was Italian, I'm sure gave him some level of trust with people that were made, right? So
Yeah, I
he's able to
wanted you to
provide
go,
us a
yeah,
very interesting account. But yeah, these guys who are non-Italian, they waited outside of the ceremony, and
yeah,
afterwards,
I wanted you to go into it specifically for that point because I think that kind of explains these relationships in a nutshell. I mean, obviously, Chicago didn't invite every non-Italian high-level associate or just non-Italian associate to wait outside to party, because these guys got made. But it shows you. I'm sure Gus Alex was there. I'm sure Murray Humphreys was there. So
Ralph Pearce was the guy
select
that
guys were involved in the process.
yeah, yeah,
That to me says everything. It's
yeah,
kind of like Rockman. Oh, we can have Rockman in the room when we discuss the Teamster stuff.
right.
We can't have Rockman in the room when we discuss the other stuff. Rockman knows what's going on in that room. He might not know the exact. Someone's probably even going to tell him afterward privately.
Yeah, yeah,
Just like Joe Watts saying to Gotti privately, "Hey, you should make Michael DiLeonardo." I'm sure that Rockman was filled in, but he can't be there for the formal meeting with Cosa Nostra leaders.
right.
Same thing in Chicago. They can't be there for the induction ceremony, but there's a wink and a nod, and they're allowed to celebrate afterward because there is something to celebrate. They probably have close relationships with these guys who got made.
Yeah,
They're happy. I mean, what it reminds me of is when Vinny Acero was made in the late 70s. It's a little different, but still, I think it fits. Where Vinny Acero, he was inducted, interestingly, at a cemetery, but he then went back to his home neighborhood, Ozone Park, and they had a big neighborhood get together at a bar to celebrate the fact that he was made. There were women there were civilians. This wasn't just associates. It was just everybody in the neighborhood who knew him was celebrating the fact that he got made. That kind of, I doubt they would ever do that in Chicago.
no, they would never. By all accounts, that would never happen.
But still, to me, that tells you something that not just that, like, the people in the neighborhood were clued into what was going on,
Yeah,
but in a way, they're part of this thing too. They're part of the subculture. They're
right.
part of the habitat that makes Cosa Nostra a functional entity. You know, so the fact that they would be there to celebrate that, hey, one of our own guys, our neighbor got made. We've known Vinny our entire life. There's something to celebrate.
Right.
He could be your advocate. This guy can potentially represent you.
Yeah,
That's
even
a
if you're
big
not a formal, on-record mafia associate in an organizational sense, you're still kind of with this guy, right? You're under his
right.
protection. And if you have a problem with somebody, like say your landlord is trying to screw you over, or your boss is going to fire you or something, or you have some guy who's an associate or a made guy with another family or another crew tries to come over and he's trying to screw over your son-in-law and take money from him or something, right? Now you can go to Vinny Asaro and you could say, look, I don't look, I got to come to you. I've known you my whole life. This guy's over here. He's harassing my stepson. I can't do anything about it. He says he's with so and so.
Yeah, and that's
I'll
sort
take
of
care
the
of it,
third.
right? Yeah,
That's sort of like the third dimension of all this. You have organizational, operational, and then the third dimension is the entire habitat those things exist in. It includes people who aren't even involved in the operations necessarily.
yeah,
They're part of the social environment. They're
yeah,
part of the family environment. And you really can't have Cosa Nostra as a long-term. Cosa Nostra can't thrive without all three of those things.
yep,
And we can separate them, like as historians or analysts, however we want to see ourselves, we can look and say, let's just look at the organization itself. That doesn't negate how necessary these other components are to what it is. But we have a certain interest that says, let's actually look and see who's made. Let's actually see who holds a formal rank and that kind of thing. But as far as the organization goes, it's not really much without the operations, whether those include members or not. And then the operations and the organization, they're not really much without this larger habitat that includes these random women in the neighborhood who are like, I'm so glad Vinny got made. I'll have a drink with him.
yep.
It's just all of those things are necessary to making it what it is. And you can't really separate them on a practical level.
Yeah, that's really important. Because I mean that's a major bait. I mean the mafia doesn't have power just because it kills people or blows their car up or something, right? I mean that's sort of like almost like the what underwrites their power is their capacity to do that, and at least in the past to largely get away with it because of the ways that they were able to have a hold over the community as well as corrupt, politicians, police and judges, right? But Otherwise, I mean, like what gives them power and leverage and influence is having those networks of people that are not formally affiliated with the mafia but extend from them, right? There's different rings. So yeah, you have these guys who are non-members who are formally affiliated with the family. They're sort of half in and half out, if you want to look at it that way, right?
Mhm.
They're sort of half members almost, right? Like in the Sicilian families, they talk about people, they say avvicinati, right? And the avvicinati means people who have been approached, people who have approached, right? And it's like they've come close to the family,
Yep.
and they're considered almost like the way I've seen it explained by Sicilian researchers is that oftentimes when they have like charts and like lists of families in Sicily, they actually don't distinguish in those charts between abicinati and actual like soldati, right?
Yeah, I think it
And
was Diego Gambetta who broke it down in one of his books, where he
yeah,
said, you know, they identified like families where they would the Sicilian authority or the Italian authorities would say like there's 10 members in this family and there's 7 avicinati, and so they saw that as part of the organization, even though the avicinati weren't members.
yep. Yeah, but they're also not civilians, right? They belong to
Right.
it. And so, but then, so say you have 10 guys, 20 guys in one of these towns, like an Agrigento or something, and which the mafia has been there now for who knows how long at this point, almost 200 years, right? And it has deep, deep roots in the community, right? They bust people, they take out the whole family. It doesn't go away. It always comes back because the soil is there to continually reproduce it, because those social networks, those relationships, those values proliferate out beyond the formal organization. How many people are related to those 10 or 20 guys, right? And they're vicinati, like kind of equivalent to what we would call like an on record associate. How many people are relatives of them? How many people are business partners of them? How many people are neighbors of them, right? How many people will do favors for them and in turn get favors done for them, right? That's a huge part of their ability that, to have 10 people run a town of 8,000 people, essentially, like that, right? And same thing in the American mafia, right? I mean, how many? So you might have a situation in like in New York and Brooklyn or Queens where people in the neighborhood are celebrating a guy getting made. In other cities, you might not have that, right? But you have dozens of people who, in some way, are sort of clients of any one guy who's made, right?
Yep.
There's a whole network of people that extend out from that person, right? And he makes things happen for them. He gets them jobs in the police department. He gets them jobs in the city services. He gets them jobs in the union locals. And then in turn, they know that if someone needs a favor who's connected, they're going to do it for them.
Right.
That's
And
influence. It's not just terror that they influence, right? Terror is the tip of the iceberg, the smallest part of it.
right. And then another side of this organizational versus operational thing that I want to touch on before we end it for sure is sometimes this plays out in the form of like who's actually in the hierarchy, where we hear this a lot, like, oh, a front boss or the power behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And I want to get your guys' thoughts on that, where, we have known examples of that, but sometimes it's not entirely clear who actually has the title of boss, who's a street boss. We hear the term street boss a lot, and I've looked into it quite a bit to see, like, when people use that, what is it referring to? And it to me, it seems to be, it's not a formal position. Boss, rappresentante, that is a formal rank. Acting boss is also a formal rank. Soto capo, underboss, all of these things that we refer to so often, these are formal ranks in the organization. There's no rank called street boss. However, it comes up a lot, and members themselves will use street boss. What it often seems to be is it could be a soldier, or it could be a captain, or it could even be somebody else. And it seems like their role is to be, I don't want to call it a glorified messenger, but they're a liaison between the administration. They represent the administration. They're usually not in a position to be making a final decision. They're
Mhm.
not an acting boss, but the street boss idea comes up a lot. We see it on charts even.
Yeah.
And because it's not a formal rank in Cosa Nostra, it's never been. I've never seen a single instance where a member says, oh, there's a rank in our family called street boss. I've been trying to wrap my brain around like what it refers to. And obviously it's kind of flexible, just like the high ranking positions are. I mean, not every boss is exactly the same. Not every underboss does things exactly the same. These things vary. But with street boss, it's, as far as I'm concerned, a more operational role, where
Yeah.
it's somebody who's a member, but his role is as more of a liaison between the administration and the streets. It's usually there to insulate, or if somebody's in prison, he might help with that. But it's very different from being an acting boss, even though they sound similar and sometimes they might be the same thing.
Yep.
But then that plays into the idea of like front bosses or the power behind the throne and stuff. Because there's sometimes when we talk about that, and there are known instances where a guy is the power behind the throne, there's a tendency to want to make him the official boss because he is the guy pulling the strings. But
the secret real boss that no one knows about.
but in reality, he's not technically the boss, and
Yeah.
that's why he is behind the scenes. So I just want to kind of get both of your thoughts on that idea.
Go ahead.
No, Angelo, go ahead. I've talked a lot, so I want to hear what your thoughts are.
People that are in these representante positions, they do listen to other people and they do take their advice. And I guess if you want to niddle it down, if people are looking for front bosses or side bosses or stuff like that, they can say, for instance, what's his name? Always listen to so and so, this person. Yeah, that's beautiful, but that doesn't make him the official secret boss. I mean, these positions are very black and white. If I'm a boss and I'm listening to Tony, who's capo de China, that doesn't make Tony the secret boss. No, he's capo de China, I'm boss in purely organizational terms. When it comes to operational, people might think, well, if you want to get the bosses here, you're going to want to talk to Tony because Tony will convince the boss. That's operational.
Yeah. That's informal. It's a de facto, right? It's not the jury position or power or authority. Yeah, this gets brought up a lot. I mean, I'm not going to get into the whole Genovese front boss thing because that's something that gets brought up a lot. A lot of people think that Chicago had a similar thing, right? And as we've, based on the the evidence that we've been able to uncover and sort of discuss and contextualize about this, there's no evidence for that whatsoever. Chicago had a formal representante, and sometimes they didn't, and they had guys acting as bosses because this often happens in families. I mean, it's a formal process. It's not a gang where some guy just seizes power and says, "Now you all listen to me," right? They have to either like vote or ratify this person, and there's a formal process to do that. So people get confused because there seems to be I don't think we need to get into the whole council thing, right? But
That'll be an episode, yeah.
that's a whole nother episode. It's a kind of can of worms, but it directly relates to this too, because all these families are variations on the same theme, but some of them have slight variations in terms of the way that the family is managed organizationally, not operationally at the very top. But there's still variations on a theme, right? They're not radically different from each other. So some families, you have a ruling council where the boss is on that council and part of it, but he doesn't have carte blanche to just basically issue any edict he wants. He has to, it's a deliberative body that's like a check and balance on him, right? So you have someone like Sam Giancana, he was the commission representative, he was the avogad on the commission. He, by all counts, was the official boss or representante of the Chicago family. But he had to deal with men like Paul Rica and Joe Accardo, who were former official bosses and basically held a chairman like role on this ruling council, right? That had to basically approve family policy and was also there to ensure that the boss didn't act as a dictator and couldn't just kill the men or something. They had to prove if a member was going to be killed. We know that from people like Teddy DeRose, who says that specifically, right? That when you have beefs, it went up to your captain and then it went up to the ruling council. So that's different than the Genovese thing. And people think that, you see, because people kind of think, oh, maybe it's the same thing. The Chicago had got Giancana and he wasn't really the boss because it was really Rica and Accardo. And it's like, no, he really was the boss. And he was the executive head of the family and the representative of the family to the national mafia. There's no doubt about that. He wasn't a puppet of other people. But the family worked in such a way that they had a sort of semblance of democracy, right? He wasn't a dictator or a tyrant that could just do whatever he wanted. He was
and the Sicilian mafia did and around the country. We'll get into the concilio and stuff to really break that down. But what Tony's saying is very necessary to understanding this.
Yeah. And then we have another example from a long time ago when Al Capone was around, and we have Nick Gentile, who refers to Salvatore Toto Loveldi, who was he was the official representante of the Chicago family from about 1930 to early 1931. right? And Gentile specifically says that he was the capo of the family, the boss of the family, but that Capone was the real capo. And Capone wasn't even a member of the Chicago family at this time. He was actually technically a capo de Cina in the Masseria Genovese family. That's a very specific, very sort of exceptional circumstance. And it's Capone was essentially angling to become boss of Chicago and wasn't in the position to do so yet. So there was a guy who was operating as the formal boss, right? Even though everybody kind of knew Capone was running, that really was a instance where I think everybody knew, probably nationwide, that Capone was really the one who was actually like controlling things. But he
And
just
it's,
was he was recognized formally within a year by Maranzano as the boss. So it's like that was a sort of interim thing that was kind of coming out of the conflict from the Castellamarese War, you know?
and it's again a situation where if you say that somebody was the power behind the scenes, the real capo behind the capo, and for those who don't know, because I think people are going to be confused by this, capo was a traditional term for boss.
Yeah.
It means chief or boss. It's literally translates to the same thing. You know, over the years, capo de Cina has been corrupted to be capo. But just when we say capo, typically we're referring to the traditional term for boss, which is rappresentante, and they also use capo.
Yeah.
But what you're saying,
Capo Borgata, right?
right?
Mafia.
I was thinking a lot of people don't know that
Yeah.
capo was the traditional term,
Yeah.
But going back to what you said, I think sometimes when you say that somebody was the real boss behind the scenes, I think they perceive that the guy who was the official boss was a nobody. That takes him down to the bottom level. He was just a peon. When in reality, he could be everything up to that. Like he might be the next most influential guy, but he still defers to this guy who's behind the scenes. And I think a good example of that, we'll avoid the whole Thierry Lombardo thing in the Genovese family.
That's what comes up.
What I will bring up, though, is Tony Salerno. Because, he was indicted in the commission case as the official boss of the Genovese family.
Right.
Turns out he was not. I don't know what his formal rank was, if he was technically the underboss, acting boss, a soldier directly. I don't actually know what Salerno's rank was, but we found out that Gigante was the official boss and Tony Salerno was basically carrying things out on his behalf. And Gigante was still doing a lot too, though, is the thing. It wasn't like he wasn't doing anything. But that doesn't mean Tony Salerno was a puppet. I mean, Tony Salerno was representing the Buffalo and Cleveland families. He was arbitrating national disputes.
Yep.
He was
had a national award.
He was an authority unto himself. And I mean, he was everything except official boss. Like the FBI didn't make a horrible, egregious mistake in thinking that. He certainly appeared to be that. He was highly respected. Tony Salerno was certainly not a nobody. I mean, he was everything except official boss. So that's a part of it too.
Yeah. Yeah. And then even earlier under when Vito Genovese was still official, you had Tommy Elby, who was an acting boss, right? And that's because of Vito Genovese's legal like other status issues and so forth, right? So that family had some history of having sort of a guy who's not, whatever his rank might be, acting under maybe something else, right? That's sort of,
we talked about it with Luciano.
Yeah.
That goes back to Luciano, where they had for 15 years? I don't know how many years, at least 10, 11 years. They had an acting boss in charge of that family. So that family had a long history of having the boss away and having an acting boss. So, I mean, some of that stuff that we see with the Genovese family, having a guy not really doing much on the surface, but holding the official title and the final authority, a lot of that could have come from their long history of having acting bosses. They might have been like, hey, this is actually working out pretty well.
Yeah. And then so earlier they did it because a guy wasn't available because of legal issues and deportation and stuff like that. But then, if it's something where Vincent Gigante wants to shield himself from increasing law enforcement pressure, it could be used for that also. Doesn't mean it started for that, right? It started, as you said, under Luciano, right? And it's something that could then be adapted to a new context where law enforcement pressure is really ramping up, and you don't want to have the guy who's actually the official boss out there meeting with people,
Right.
What were you going to say, Angelo? You wanted to...
When it comes to front bosses, and I guess I consider that these formal positions are secret positions. They're not meant to be spilled for widespread consumption, even down to the associates. So a lot of times when people become boss or whatever other position, they're not thinking, okay, I got to shield myself and think, make other people think that this guy's the real boss. When it's supposed to be, listen, I'm here, keep it to yourselves, and things will flow out from there.
Yeah, that's why I think maybe it started as just like having acting bosses because guys weren't available, but they still had a lot of respect, so they didn't want to replace them, or they couldn't because the person was still technically boss. And there's a formal, process to that, right? And maybe, like I said, over time with the Gigante Salerno era, with increasing law enforcement pressure, that sort of was available to then, in that context, be used to sort of shield the administration, right? Doesn't mean it started for that reason, like they explicitly intended it for that. Because we see that going way back in the family. So I think there's a tradition of that. But I think it's originally was probably easily explainable as having a guy as an acting boss, you know?
Here's
Um,
a little known fact that might play into this, which is for whatever reason this isn't widely known. Everybody knows about the member introduction rule that you need a third party to say, hey, John, meet Joe. He's an amico nos. Joe, meet John, amico nos. Uh, the same rule applies to promotions, where if a guy is promoted to captain, if a guy is promoted to boss, a third party technically has to reintroduce him, even to members he already knows as members,
Yep.
using his new title. Like, for example, when Joe Massino promoted his brother-in-law Salvatale to underboss, he had another guy witness it so that that guy could then go out on the street and introduce Salvatale to people as the new underboss. Salvatale, he wasn't allowed to go out and just say, hey, even to a guy who he already knows,
Yep.
they've already been introduced as made members, he still has to have a third party say, hey, Sal, this is Sal, meet your new underboss. I imagine that rule gets broken, or it doesn't necessarily need to be stated. Like if someone knows that Sal Vitale is the underboss, they're going to listen to him, or they're going to show him a certain amount of respect. And so I wonder if that's ever utilized to their benefit, where we're going to promote a guy to official boss, but we're not going to introduce him with his new title to very many people. Um,
Yeah.
and that also shows you that there's a lot of formality to that position. The fact that you have to be reintroduced using it. I know Di Leonardo said he never actually met the acting, or I don't know if he was official, but the guy Zeke something. He said he never actually met him as the official, met him using his new title, but he knew that he had that position.
People
And
talked
so I
about
wonder how much of that is kind of used to their benefit to be like, we don't want somebody to be able to say, if somebody flips, we don't want them to be able to say, yeah, he's the underboss and I met him as such.
I was formally introduced to him as such, and that's
Yeah,
the rule. So therefore,
right.
he must be the underboss, right? Yeah.
Yeah, they would just have to say, well, I was told that, or I inferred that.
Yeah.
And so they might,
That. Yeah. Yeah.
uh, people don't really talk about that rule very much, but I think it plays into all this, that it's like guys have to, you can't just go up, even if you're the boss, you can't just go up to a guy and say, I'm the rappresentante. I'm sure if he did that, it would be no problem. I don't think anybody's going to say, oh, hey, the boss, the boss just told me he was the boss. But still, that could play into this too. They might limit the number of people who know that.
Well, Angelo has going back to the sort of Genovese family too, right? And the idea that like, yeah, they don't give out memos like when guys are promoted, and they don't like, it's not like they have like a letterhead that's like, Genovese Borgata, Rappresentante Vincent Chingiganti or something, right? They and it's important to remember these are large families. I mean, by mafia standards, these are unprecedentedly large families. All the New York families, but especially the Genovese and Gambino families, right? You're talking about families with 200, 300 something members, right? 20 crews, right? Just I mean, really large in terms of mafia organizations. I mean, like way out on the right tail of the distribution, right? So even though people think the New York mafia is like the golden exemplar of like the mafia, it's anomalous in many ways, right? And I think Angelo has brought this up in previous conversations that I mean it looks really different when you compare a family like the Genovese, even though they have the same formal structures, right? To these smaller, really sort of old school traditional families we have in most of the rest of the US. Families like Tampa, New Orleans, Dallas, right? Where I mean everybody can't really know each other. That I mean, it's imagine all the introductions that would have to be done to introduce everybody in the Genovese family to each other, even if they wanted to, right? And they weren't trying to sort of keep heat down and be secretive, right? Every time anybody was promoted or demoted, they have to reintroduce them to everybody else, I mean, they'd be doing nothing but introductions, right? So, I mean, but a family like Dallas or New Orleans, where they have, say, 10 or less members at certain times, right? When we're talking about like the 1950s or 60s or something, right? Very, very small formal membership in these families. Old school, very secretive, all Sicilian membership for the most part, right? You know, in those families, I think Angelo has said before, it's like the boss is the person who's most in the public. Everybody knows Carlos Marcello, right?
Yeah.
Calogero Minacore, they call him Carlos Marcello, right? I mean, this guy, everybody knows who he is, right? Your non-mafia enthusiast knows who he is because he gets caught up in the whole JFK conspiracy stuff, right? But I mean, same thing with Santos Trafficante Senior and Junior. Everybody has heard those names who has any knowledge of the mafia, right?
Yeah, traditionally the boss was the most publicly
Yep,
available guy. If somebody came to town, he would be put into contact with the rappresentante. The
yep,
boss wasn't hidden behind the scenes because at that point there was less legal scrutiny. Um, the idea of the boss hiding in the shadows and being insulated is a relatively later development.
yeah,
And it came about largely because of the amount of publicity and law enforcement pressure.
yeah,
And you see this if you look at like a story like Gentile, where he would go to a place and he would have direct access to the boss. Gentile's a kind of a different example because he was a high-ranking member pretty much wherever he went. But you see it even with lower level guys where it wasn't like we're hiding the boss from you. The boss was the guy with resources. The boss was the guy you contact. He was often a very charismatic,
yep,
socially well connected personality.
yeah,
He often had a lot of self-generated wealth.
hmm,
He was a hub. He was chosen for that position because he was a hub in the network, and you can't be a hub in the network if you're not available to people. So
yeah.
the boss was supposed to be available. It's a relatively newer uh, incarnation of that position that he's the guy behind the scenes or in the shadows.
Yeah.
What you're saying is very true.
Yeah, it happens in larger families like New York and Chicago, and it happens in families like New York and Chicago that are also basically like the heads of large criminal racket syndicates, right? These small families, not that they didn't have some illegal activities, right? Because it's the mafia and they do all sorts of things to make money and to create advantage for themselves and their clients. But I mean, by all accounts, by like the 1960s, these families, I mean, not only were they very small in terms of formal membership, right, but they had little in the way of criminal rackets, right? Very modest, right? They weren't running massive crime syndicates like the way that they were in the major cities, right? That also plays into it, right? Because there isn't, I mean, there isn't the same sort of law enforcement pressure on them, right? They have very few members, so they never have anybody that flips. So we're in the position where we know the boss and we can't identify anybody else in the family. Whereas if
Right. And then the
now,
relationships too.
you can identify 250 members, but you're not sure who the boss is in some cases, you know?
You made a really good point about the size of the families, and not just the size, but the diversity. You think about a tradition Sicilian family. A lot of those members are interrelated. They're
Yep.
from the same little village, the same little district, and so
Yep.
they all know each other. They've all known each other for generations. In these smaller U.S. families, it's the same. I mean, look at Tampa, where the
100%.
most the most readily available and easily identified member was Santo Trafficante, but he didn't. His family they were all from the same three towns in Agrigento.
Yeah.
Most of them were part of interrelated clans from those villages.
Yeah.
So them having direct access to the boss, it wasn't a liability.
Yeah.
Whereas in New York City, like look at the Gambino family, where let's say they have 300 members. It's not just that they have 300 members; it's that these guys came from all kinds of different backgrounds. They really have not. Many of them have nothing in common beyond the fact that they might have criminal or business partnerships. They're not part of these clans. They don't have that sort of intimacy that you see in smaller families, where it's not just the fact that these guys know each other and live in the same city. It's that there are generations, there's hometowns, there's blood. That would make need to insulate a boss less of a priority.
Yeah. It's really important. I mean, and then in Tampa, right? They recreated this a sort of an Americanized version of a sort of Sicilian village in many ways in Ybor City, right? Not that it had Italians and it had Cubans and Spanish living there, but the majority of the Italians, from what I can tell, they reflect the makeup of the family, right? From the same cluster of towns in Agrigento province. So these people are all coming from interconnected families that are, connected to the mafia. We can assume at some level back in their hometowns, and then they're living in an Italian community which is very tight knit, very intimate, right? Very closely sort of bound together in a small geographic area, right? It's completely different than East Harlem or Taylor Street or South Philadelphia, right? Where there's Italians from every part of Italy, right?
And the visibility is built right into the word. The word rappresentante, representative, it's built right into there. The reason why he's putting himself out there and he's accessible to bosses around the country, not to say anybody could just go up to him, but still, as the representative, he that comes with it a certain availability and a certain visibility that plays into what you're saying.
Yep.
You know,
Yeah, so we struggle to identify them. I mean, Tampa, because we have people like Scott Deitch, who hopefully will be a guest on the show, who's
yep.
written wonderful books and articles about Tampa. We're able to stand on the shoulders of giants when it comes to that. We know that Rick has done, Richard Warner, that's one of, our archaeology team, has done a lot of really important work on New Orleans, but it's difficult. It's really a difficult family because, I mean, if you think Chicago has little inside info, I mean, it's a wealth of info for Chicago compared to some of these other families,
Right.
right? Where there's really, I mean, it's also the membership is tiny by all appearances, and that's on purpose. I mean, New Orleans had a significant Sicilian population; it still does, at least of people who are Sicilian descendants, right? Um, they could have recruited more people, right? They could have had a larger family if they wanted to. They almost certainly did if you go back decades and decades, right? But it's basically like a clique of people that surround Carlos Marcello by the time we're in the 1960s, right? People that are part of this really tight knit inner circle. Now he would have had all sorts of connections, both within the Sicilian and wider community, and we know he did, right? But he's the guy out there. He's like the focal point. He's the node, right? Exactly like what you're saying is sort of the original model for the Rappresentante. Same, Dallas didn't have the same kind of robust Sicilian community, so they were really sort of in a dire straits, I think, because they didn't have the sort of potential to build that kind of network in a place like Dallas, but their family was all, people from the same cluster of towns in Tropony, right?
Yeah, it's a good thing we have such a wealth of inside information on the Birmingham family because we don't have to worry about them. Now, obviously, that's the family we know the least about. But when I dug into them, the only guy that I was able to, even theorize was a probable member. I mean, I listed some other people in my article about that, but like the most likely guy, I think, was also most likely the boss for a time.
Yeah,
Because he was in national contact with the boss of Boston as well as Nicola Gentile,
right.
and it would make sense that that guy would be the boss. It's a theory, but
Yeah,
I would not state that definitively.
yeah,
But it would make sense that the one guy we're able to really identify as being somebody there would have had those national ties, and he's also the guy we're able to recognize as having had a possible role like that. And I think it plays into this, where it's like the FBI had a much easier time identifying bosses all around the country than they had identifying the members under those bosses, which
yeah.
kind of goes against our current mindset that, like, oh, we know who all the rank and file guys are, a lot of them. We don't know who the boss is. We don't know who's hiding behind the scenes.
Yeah, well, you look at like Chicago, for example, right? And we know because we have some good CI accounts, right? We have Augie Maniaci, who was a member of the Milwaukee outfit, right? We have Frank Pincero, who is we've already talked about both of these guys, right? Because they're really important sources of information. They gave a lot of info as mafia members to the FBI about their own families and about other families. But Frank Pincero from the LA family, right? They give us sort of accounts so we'd understand how when other families needed to reach out to Chicago, because Chicago was the avant-garde for that region essentially, right? They represented a bunch of other smaller mafia families that didn't have seats on the commission. You know, Frank Balistrieri, who was the boss in the 60s and 70s of the Milwaukee family, when he needed to reach out to Chicago, he went through Phil Alderizio, right? And he knew like Sam Battaglia, he knew some other people, right? He knew Giancana, but it looks like his liaison was Phil Alderizio. That's why people called him Milwaukee Phil. And I've seen on the internet that he was from Milwaukee. Milwaukee Phil had no personal connection to Milwaukee. He's from Yonkers and then moved to Chicago as a kid. no connection to Milwaukee aside from personal connections later in life, right? So, but he went through, as far as we know, from Frank Pompensero actually in the late '60s, Alderizio, even though people have thought over the years he was a captain or even like a acting boss of the Chicago family, he was a soldier direct with Giancana. We have this direct from a member, from Frank Pompensero. So it's like when the Milwaukee boss needs to get a hold of the Chicago administration, it looks like they would go through a soldier, technically, Phil Alderizio, right? When Pompensero was with Tony Giordano, who was the boss of the St. Louis outfit, right? Boss of another small family where all the members are Sicilian. Milwaukee is pretty much like this also, right? Really old school family. Everybody is coming from the same neighborhood. They're almost all Sicilian, right? Very small membership. They need to go to this powerhouse in Chicago, right? Because that's their representative politically. And it looks, from what we can tell from Frank Pompensero's account, him and Tony Giordano have to go to Joey Aiuppa. And Joey Aiuppa at that point was a captain. He wasn't a boss. This was before he became a boss in the 70s. This was in the 60s, right? So it's like, yeah, the bosses, even to other bosses, is not immediately accessible, right?
And the idea of the soldier direct with the administration draws us all the way back to the beginning. We were talking about a soldier not really having a ceiling under him.
Yep.
Angelo brought up Nick Caramondi of Philadelphia. He says in his book that I think right before he got arrested or flipped or whatever he did, he and another guy were placed direct with Nicky Scarfo, or there was a plan to do that at the very least. And Caramondi says in his book that being a soldier direct with the boss was better than being a Cappuccino. It was a very unique and significant position. Like, it sounds to me like you're essentially a high-ranking member without the responsibilities.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and then like, a person like Phil Alderizio, who's anybody who knows something about the mob, even, people that don't know much about Chicago, I'm sure have heard of this person, right? Milwaukee Phil.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, this is a person that, again, by appearance, from outside appearances, we would think this person had a higher formal rank than what we actually, we have info directly from a member of another family who knew him and worked with him and was introduced to him
Yeah.
and understood him to only be a soldier at this point in the late 1960s, right? So, I mean, yeah, you can have a guy who's a soldier, he's direct with the administration or direct with the boss, which means he doesn't answer to another captain. He's he's technically a soldier, but he has a lot of freedom, a lot of leeway.
He's
And this person,
perceived as something more because people, they
yep,
perceived him as, and it's not that he was less than what they
yeah,
perceived. It's just that the soldier role can be that.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
and I think that's a
The
good
boss
way
would
to
have
kind of,
that too, answering to him directly.
yeah. And so, I mean, I think we'll be revisiting this topic as we go. It'll probably come up at some point as we discuss virtually anything and everything.
Yeah,
I'm glad we did this early on because I think people, like, when I've talked to people about this who haven't thought about it before, it makes sense to them once they kind of put it in this context.
yeah,
And as outsiders, we separate the organization from the operation, but on the street, they don't really need to. They know who's made, they
yep,
know who has authority,
right,
they know who runs this business, who works for that business.
yep,
They don't have to go around, like members aren't going around the street, associates aren't going around the street saying, well, is his role operational or organizational? Like, they don't have to think that. They wouldn't even think of those terms. They just kind of intuitively understand it because it's built into it.
yeah,
And we're making the distinction for people who are interested in the subject because it's a source of constant confusion. It's a source of error.
yeah,
We've all gone through so much information that is erroneous because it's conflating operational with organizational.
right.
Not that they don't meet somewhere in the middle, not that they don't parallel each other in many cases,
Right.
but there's a distinction there.
Yeah, it's an analytic. It's a formal distinction that's actually made within the phenomenon itself, right, by the members of it. But
Right.
it's also an analytic distinction that we're making as researchers. We want to understand this. We want to be able to identify what the basic sort of structures and parts are to it, and then be able
Yep.
to fit people and events into those, right? So to understand that distinction that Angelo is really responsible for articulating and the way that he did it, right?
Yep.
Organizational versus operational. So once you explain that to somebody, I think it's very intuitive. And
Absolutely.
it's to analyze this, it's to make sense of it, both on in its own internal logic as well as the way that we understand it as researchers, right? Which might be a little bit more abstract in a lot of cases. But it's really important to actually get a grasp on it. And if you don't, it's like you said, it generates a lot of errors, a lot of misunderstanding, right? And you're not really
And it helps
grasping
you
what
read.
this thing is.
It helps you process things like FBI reports too, because we've all seen so many FBI reports where it's like, oh, this guy's the guy. They use vague language, be like, oh, everybody seems to be deferring to so and so now. Like, oh,
Yeah,
he's the power now.
yeah,
And if you were to look at that blindly, you'd be like, oh, well, that means he's the boss. That means he's the captain.
yeah.
And we know that's not always the case.
No,
And you can be convinced of something that wasn't a reality when you interpret it that way.
yeah,
And so we just want to break that down. We
yeah.
want
Those are
to know
formal
exactly
offices.
what's that.
Those are formal offices. Those are formal titles, and there's also a formal process to actually ratify and install somebody. You know,
Right.
which is why you have acting captains, you have acting bosses, you have people acting in these positions, acting consigliere in some families, right? Because you have a person that's filling that role, but formally doesn't have that appointment yet, right?
Yep.
Yeah, and so it's that alone tells you how important the formal position itself is, right? Is that people
You know
make
what? And if there were examples where if a made member came and said, "Oh, it didn't matter at all," I would
yeah,
listen to that. It would be exceptional in the larger body of research we've all put together. It
right,
would be exceptional, but I'd be just as interested in it. Like when some of these anomalies come up, like inducting guys who may have only been half Italian on their mother's side. I'm interested in those anomalies too, because it's the exceptions that prove the rule. And so it's not like we're closed off to other information. It's just that the larger body of research we've collected shows that there's a heavy distinction between those things. And if we want to talk about it accurately, these are the terms we use to understand that operation, organization.
yeah,
It's there, and members themselves who we defer to. We defer to member sources above all else.
right,
Associates have interesting information,
yeah,
but I will 100% of the time take a made member's word about the inner workings of his organization
yep,
over the perception of an associate. The perception
yep,
of the associate is important, but I always defer to the made member, and then from there I defer to the rank.
yep,
You know, if a source is higher ranking, unless he says something that's just an egregious lie,
yep.
I'm more likely to defer to him.
Yeah, well, you have to ask. I mean, what position is a person in order to have access to this information or
Yeah.
insight, right? And obviously a person who is a member of a family or even of any family, if he interacts with members of other families like Bump and Sarah or Mariachi did, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
is going to be in a position to know things for a fact that people who are not inducted members will not be in the same position to,
Right, and
right?
that's something we should have laid out in the first episode, but it'll
Yeah,
become more clear in time. Is that we don't just try to use primary sources.
yeah,
We prefer to use member sources,
yeah,
made members who cooperated with the FBI, flipped,
yeah,
wrote memoirs. Doesn't mean we don't challenge them. It doesn't mean we don't look at them critically. But those are the best sources we have,
yeah.
and they've informed our view of this operational versus organizational distinction.
Yeah, 100%.
So Angela had to dip off.
Yeah, I
So
think I think it's time to probably call an end to the
I
episode.
I think so.
I think this was a great conversation. Some of it
Absolutely.
is important, sort of foundational stuff that I think we have to cover because it's really some of this is we've been thinking like this and discussing this stuff for so long, right? That
Yep.
it's sort of second nature to us, right? But
Right.
it really this is foundational to the perspective through which we analyze things.
Yep.
Yeah.
All
All
right,
right,
man.
Eric, and
Good conversation.
have a great night, guys.